Greetings and welcome to this YouTube video in which I'll tell you about my first novel, a book called A Body in Westminster Abbey, a Victorian murder mystery. My name's Peter Thomas. I'm a retired Anglican clergyman and now live in Taunton. This introduction will be mainly a PowerPoint presentation which is going to be used when the book is launched sometime at the beginning of 2024. I do hope that you enjoy this presentation. If you would be more interested in obtaining a copy of the book, then please get in touch with me either through the comments or my email address is pthomas5@aol.com. I'm now going to share the screen and take us to a story of the book. For Christmas 2022, I received this book, Amazing Things Will Happen, from my wife. And inside was a post-it, Christmas Ends at Midnight by P.J. Thomas. For maybe 20 years, it had been the intended title of my first novel. This empty book was an incentive to get writing. My wife herself has written a number of books, including her first one, At a Stroke, about her grandfather's grandfather, who embezzled quite a lot of money from a bank in the middle of the 19th century. And he, John Durden, also appears in my novel. Here's a picture of John. We're often told to write about that which we know about. And although I don't know all that much about the middle of the 19th century, I do know quite a lot about Westminster Abbey. For 1 week a year, for the last 25 years, I've served there as a duty chaplain, leading prayers and occasional services. Here's what I look like, all dressed up. Also for Christmas 2022, I received this book, Westminster Abbey, A Church in History, the first academic history of the Abbey. And it reminded me of a rather eccentric 19th century dean. I read a number of other books about the Victorian times to help in the background to this novel. So the book is in 5 parts about a fictional man called Thomas Marshall. We talk about his lives, about his death, about his killer, about the trial concerning Thomas Marshall, and finally ask the question, why was Thomas Marshall killed? The introductory part talks about the lives of Thomas Marshall. His family life, brought up in North London, his father was a publisher. His married life, his wife, I think, slightly felt that she'd stepped down a bit in life when she married him, but they lived with their 2 children in a new property off the new Victoria Street. His office life, he worked as a banker's clerk in the Commercial Bank of London in Henrietta Street near Covent Garden. It was there he was working with John Durden and with a man called Joseph Anning. His church life was centered around Westminster Abbey. He'd been a chorister there when he was a child at Westminster School and had continued to sing in the choir into his adult life. But he also got involved in some of the political life of the Abbey and had a particular friend in Canon Brooks, one of the staff. Thomas's brother, Gerald Marshall, was a leading light in the Republican movement. And the other life of Thomas Marshall was among the poor, where he interviewed and spent time with them. There are 3 real people at the centre of this story. This is William Buckland. He was the dean, the senior clergyman of Westminster Abbey in the early 1850s. This is Henry Mayhew. He was a journalist and a reporter who wrote about the poor of London. And this is Mary Anning, famous as a paleontologist, looking for fossils in her home area of Lyme Regis. This is, or was, Henry's wine bar in Henrietta Street. This was the location of the Commercial Bank of England. And Anne and I visited a few years ago, and we could go inside and see where it was that the real John Durden and the fictional Thomas Marshall worked. Here's a layout of Westminster Abbey and identifies a particular room, Jericho, which opens on to the nave, but is also part of the deanery. This map gives a further insight to the area that the adventures take place. The Whitehall is actually to the east, going up the page, where Scotland Yard is further up that road. On the side of the Thames, we have the Houses of Parliament. They're being rebuilt as in 1851, having had a disastrous fire earlier in the century. And further down the shoreline, we come to Abbott's and Truman, and Abbott's woodworking yard plays an important part. West of the Abbey is the Devil's Acre, one of the poorest and most disreputable areas of London. On the edge of the new Victoria Street, in Albert Mansions, is where Thomas and his family live. And around Dean's Yard is Westminster School. At the beginning of the book, we also have a list of the characters involved, and these identify which were real people and which are the imagination of your author. Westminster Abbey is also a character in the book, and Anne made this model from a gift she was made just recent Christmas from one of our boys. As you look at the Abbey, the main central part is maybe 750 years old. To the right-hand side, Henry VII's Chapel and the iconic towers of Nicholas Hawksmoor stand at the west end. Adjacent to the cloisters is the deanery, the home of the dean. And J here marks Jerusalem and Jericho, two buildings or two rooms within the deanery that open out into the abbey. This is the Jerusalem chamber. It was here that the authorized version of the Bible was conceived. The Westminster Confession was written and Henry IV died. So one of our three main real characters is William Buckland. His father was a vicar of Axminster in Devon, and William went to Corpus Christi College at Oxford, where he studied science. When he left his undergraduate course, he was ordained, as many people were, but he returned immediately as a lecturer, the first lecturer in geology. He hadn't intended to go into the church, but was offered a role as a canon of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. And then subsequently, through the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, acting on behalf of Queen Victoria, he was offered the post of Dean of Westminster Abbey. He'd also been quite involved in the life of fossils, and he was the first person to describe a dinosaur. His wife was quite keen on them taking the Westminster job because with it came a country living at Islip in Middlesex, and the plaque on the gate identifies William Buckland's residence there. Quite an eccentric man. He kept a menagerie in the deanery. There would be eagles flying around, a leopard, I think, at one point. And he would also eat various meats of different animals, even on one occasion, a human heart, albeit the embalmed heart of Louis XIV of France. He got his hands dirty, literally clearing out the sewage from the gutters and the drains around Westminster School, and arranged for introduction of a new drainage system and of a new choir school. He erected a Foucault's pendulum in the Abbey to show evidence of perpetual motion, and also continued to study geology and fossils. But he was very much involved in the life and worship of the Abbey as well, and was quite radical in his time. He wanted to change the worship, he wanted to bring in new songs, he wanted to bring in new liturgy, and he even wanted to change the structure inside the Abbey. At the main crossing, where the way towards the north and south transepts was blocked by a series of seats and a screen, which meant only a limited number of people from the choir area could see the high altar. So he had those screens removed and new choir stalls introduced, which enabled maybe up to another 800 people to be able to witness what was happening in the communion service. But that was quite controversial, and Thomas Marshall and Canon Brooks were amongst those who favoured the old ways. William Buckland was also a great writer, and he wrote on the power, wisdom, and goodness of God as manifested in the creation. This book plays a significant role in my story. It was one of a series of treatises from a bequest by, I think, the Duke of Bridgewater, published again through the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And this is Henry Mayhew. Henry was a student at Westminster School, and in my book, Thomas Marshall tutors him for a while. He goes off to write, becoming a journalist, working for Punch and marrying the daughter of the proprietor of Punch. He goes to the bank to open a new account, and there he meets with Thomas Marshall. Henry Mayhew is very interested and very aware of the poverty in London and seeks to find understanding of employment and the needs of the poor. So he wrote a number of articles under the title London Labour and London Poor. The book was published in 1851, and he needed people to help him in his writing and in his interviewing. And Thomas Marshall joins him, talking to the woodworkers in various places, the costermongers, and going and visiting the poor and getting involved in some of the politics, visiting places like a poor asylum. Some of the letters or articles in the London Morning Chronicle are included in Mayhew's London. And the third of the real characters was Mary Anning, although she was dead before my story starts. But she and her brother Joseph, who in my story has gone to work in the same bank as Thomas, when they were children, the only two surviving children of the 9 or 10 born to their parents, they used to collect fossils on the seashore at Lyme Regis and try to sell them from their father's shop. And she became quite proficient in discovering new fossils, including this plesiosaur. But because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to write about them or speak about them. And her name was not that well known. Indeed, people like William Buckland often took credit for some of her work. And she knew Buckland well. He used to come and visit her in Lyme Regis and would often stay there over the Christmas period. I also get involved in the disputes taking place in the London policing service. This is Scotland Yard, a newly introduced service. Some of you may have come across the suspicions of Mr. Witcher, talking about one of the earliest detectives. And the detectives were introduced to solve crimes and had a broader brief than the police. Whereas the police were dressed in a more traditional way, this gentleman would probably have a belt and a whistle or a rattle and a baton, a truncheon. But they resented the fact that the detectives got all the good jobs. So we explore some of the tensions between them. We don't discover the body of Thomas Marshall until after page 100. And by page 200, we know who killed him. And we follow that man to Millbank, the prison now on this, where the Tate Britain is, From there, we go and share in his trial at the Old Bailey. And eventually he's taken to prison in Pentonville. So although they discover who killed Thomas Marshall, there's still quite a lot of questions asked about why was he killed? The various organizations and individuals and groups who may have had an interest in getting rid of him. And we explore those options through the book. And we only discover in the last paragraph who it was who was responsible for the death of Thomas Marshall. So I do hope you've enjoyed this introduction. It may have whetted your appetite. And I say, if you want to get in touch, either in the comments below or to my email address at pthomas5@aol.com. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.